Good morning and welcome to the Daily Cyber Briefing for Friday, the 22nd of November. I'm Stephen Ridgway. There is a flaw in the Fortinet client VPN well, the article says enables undetected brute force attacks, but that's I suppose it kind of does. But what the issue is, and I think it's a very interesting issue. I'm always interested in this stuff, aren't I? It is an interesting issue around a blind spot in the way that logging is undertaken. So, if you think through the process, those of you that have worked with AAA or Radius or whatever in the past will get these concepts immediately. There's a difference between authenticating somebody and authorizing them to undertake specific actions. Well, Fortinet VPN servers are capable of using all of those approaches, like all of those different stages in the getting logged on process. The way that works is, the first question is, are you the person can you identify yourself as being the person who is supposed to be able to do this thing, which is the authentication bit. And then the next question is, are you allowed to do the action which you're attempting to do, which is the authorization piece. So in the case of a VPN, are you a user who has rights, permissions to log on via a VPN? Yes. Are you allowed to log on from, let's say, this particular location or from this particular device or whatever it might be? Well, those two steps are undertaken sequentially. And the Fortinet solution logs your successful attempt only after the authorization step has been passed. Otherwise, it would log it as a form of failed logon attempt. So, obviously, logging failed logon attempts is useful, not kind of the most useful primary source of information if you're trying to work out that somebody's attacking you, because there are so many. If you've got internet-facing stuff, you will be inundated with failed logon attempts, mostly by bots using well-known password lists. But you'd also get a failed logon attempt if the user correctly authenticated, but the action they were trying to undertake was prohibited for whatever reason. A different kind of log, but you'd still log that as a failure. A successful logon then would be, yes, you're a permitted user, and yes, you are trying to do something you are permitted to do. Now, if you have the ability, which it appears in this scenario it's possible to do, if you can interrupt the logon process after authentication but before authorization, it's possible to determine that you have valid user credentials without triggering a failed logon or a successful logon log. Now, why does this matter? Well, it means you can spend a lot of time attempting, as I say, brute forcing Fortinet VPN servers. And if you are good at what you're doing, you can do that without the failed or successful logons being logged into the Fortinet system or subsequently on into a SIEM or security visibility tooling. When you, or if you find credentials that work, you haven't blown those credentials, as in notified the defenders that you have discovered functioning username password pairs. And you can keep those for later steps or later parts of your kill chain to be used for whatever. So it's part of that information gathering. Do I have valid credentials or not? So one of the things about in the kill chain around information gathering is that a lot of the information gathering is done in ways that are very difficult to detect. Well, this is something that kind of historically it would have been detectable, but they found a way around it. Anyway, what you can say, so basically, firstly, Fortinet, I'm sure, is looking to enhance logging around this. So, I mean, the obvious thing, as that any of you that used the old Cisco AAA stuff would know, you can log the different stages. So hopefully Fortinet will rapidly improve its logging processes to record the authentication bits and the authorization bits separately, rather than waiting until the very end and then recording it as successful or failed. As a user, you can implement multi-factor authentication if you haven't already done so, which significantly reduces the likelihood that an attack like this would ever be successful. It is worth regularly auditing and updating your VPN solutions. Don't let these things sort of sit on the edge of your environment, virtual or physical, and just assume they're okay. And also, you could consider putting web application firewalls in front of VPN servers, which may give you the opportunity to identify these things earlier. So, yeah. The other thing is, absolutely would strongly recommend that you log both failed and successful VPN attempts. In fact, pretty much for any authentication, log your successful attempts as well as your failed attempts. Yes, failed attempts are interesting because in an environment which is not publicly available, a significant number of failed attempts could be an indicator of attack or an indicator of compromise. However, often you don't know that people don't get into your environment and then start brute forcing things. They've got into your environment because they've already got credentials one way or another. And what we much more regularly see is that the credentials are compromised in some way which is harder to detect, and then used to do various things, such as if you manage to get access to domain administrators, some of your IT team's accounts, you might then use legitimate accounts to log onto your your endpoint protection solution, and put in place white lists for your own specific piece of malware, that sort of stuff. So having logs of successful logons is really useful, because if an account ever does get compromised, you want to be able to go and see where has this account been used, what's happened. Now, I know sort of historically, less so now, but historically, there's been a feeling that just generates far too much information and wouldn't be useful because, well, clearly they're authenticated, authorized users. Well, they only are as long as the account hasn't been compromised. Anyway, long discussion this morning about, or long waffle, call it what you like, about this whole concept about understanding what's going on from an authentication and authorization perspective. Key thing is be aware that logging both of those actions is incredibly useful to defenders when trying to unpick what's actually going on. Anyway, on a completely different subject, you might have seen in the news over the last few days that the questions around whether teenagers, children, frankly, under the age of 16, should or shouldn't be banned from social media platforms. It's kind of just crept back onto the radar again over the last few days as a discussion point in the UK. However, the Australian government has unveiled what they're claiming to be the world's first legislation setting a minimum age of 16 for social media use. Obviously the intention is to bolster online safety for young Australians. It moves a lot of the responsibility for controlling access to these platforms from the users themselves and their parents, and it moves that responsibility to the platforms. There's no particular surprises as to what's in this bill. There will be substantial penalties for persistent breaches. There are requirements for enhanced privacy safeguards, ring fencing and destroying data collected for compliance, and so on. Will be there. And the bill is designed to evolve alongside new digital services and technologies. So it is at least intended to be flexible enough to cope with whatever may happen later. Now, I think there's a very good point that's been made. The Australian Prime Minister is quoted as saying, "We know that social media is doing social harm. We want Australian children to have a childhood, and we want parents to know that the government is in their corner." So, and I think that's absolutely right. Unquestionably, there is a lot of harm created through social media. A lot of it, though, isn't. Okay, you've got to bear in mind that the vast majority of teenagers using social media are just doing it to communicate with their friends. But the difficulty is when it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong. So I think it's absolutely 100% understand what they are trying to do here. I think the biggest issue, well, there's going to be two issues with anything in this space, and I'm hoping that when details come through around what they're doing here, they will have thought this stuff through and at least have some idea about how they're addressing these two issues. The first one is teenagers are remarkably good at working around restrictions if they want to do something. How are you going to prevent under 16s from using these platforms? How are you going to be able to enforce age checks or stop teenagers from using accounts created legitimately by people who are older? I mean, this is like how are you going to make sure that the age enforcement checks work at scale? And how are you going to do that? I mean, there are worries about if you try to do it legitimate, and the vast majority, I suppose, of teenagers will just, they'll follow the rules. and will do things like upload ID documents. Well, how is that stuff going to be protected at the platform end? There is little in the way of evidence that any organisation, private, public, or government, is good at securing that sort of stuff. So that's a concern. But I think for me, more concerningly, is that this legislation comes out of discussions around specific social media platforms. So we're thinking here about things like Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, X Twitter, and defining those as age-restricted social media platforms, because there are other platforms which it's very important that young people still have access to, obviously. There's certain messaging services, gaming is important to young people, platforms for health, education, so on and so forth, Google Classroom, YouTube, whatever, which you don't kind of want to sweep up into, or you may not want to sweep up into this sort of legislation. So how are you going to classify the ones which need age verification and the ones that don't? And then even more importantly, social media is a very fluid environment. The well-known platforms, like X and Instagram and TikTok, Snapchat, and whatever. Yes, they're well known, and they're well known to people of my generation, and we're all very well aware of this sort of stuff. However, I think if you're working in the industry, as most listeners I'm sure are, you're well aware of the fact that there are literally dozens of smaller, unregulated or unregulatable platforms, things that can just spring up. Even major players, the Guardian exited X and went off to, I can't remember where they went, but they've gone off to somewhere else. Well, okay, how many of these other places are we going to try and catch in this sort of legislation? How is this going to work? And what about the likes of Discord or I forget the name of it now, but there are platforms that you can run in non-centralized ways, spin up your own server kind of stuff, all of which are very popular. And this stuff is just being generated in great quantities whenever somebody wants a new platform. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm going to have to wait and see how it goes with this sort of legislation. I suspect it will either be heavy-handed or it will be ineffectual, or it will be heavy-handed and ineffectual. But we'll have to wait and see. Okay, and then finally from me for today and for this week, if you are a pen tester, do be aware that cyber criminal groups, I nearly didn't talk about this one, I think I saw this a day or two ago, but actually I think it's not a bad way to finish the week. Cyber criminal groups are now looking to employ pen testers in order to find vulnerabilities in organisations and in systems. So cyber criminals clearly are very good at finding and exploiting vulnerabilities, but you know what? There are a lot of good pen testers out there that are not criminals. Well, just be aware that criminal gangs are actually recruiting. They will pay you to go and do nefarious stuff. I don't know from the articles that I've been reading whether it's clear if you're being targeted. It looks like you're being headhunted, perhaps even for these things. Whether the groups that you might end up working for are dodgy or not. But I would say if you do find yourself being targeted as a pen tester, just do make sure that you don't end up working for a criminal group by mistake. Okay, that's all from me for today.